Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another bit of Total War Warhammer 2 quick match gameplay. This time around I'm playing as the Wood Elves against the Warriors of Chaos, led by Jush on the map Isle of the Crimson Skull. I wanted to try out some of the new Elven units and, well, not new Elven units, but some of the reworked Elven units, more specifically the Wildwood Rangers. And I give them a shot. I figured that they'd have a decent shake against Chaos, which of course tends to bring a lot of heavily armored infantry, so decided to kind of bring a pair of them here. As it would turn out, it might not have been the best of choices. In this match, I also wanted to try to bring a decent amount of shooting, figuring that it would be my best bet, really, at bringing down enemy heavily armored infantry. Unfortunately, because of that, I did go a bit light on the front line, and my flanking force is only some Wild Riders. So for the core of my army here, I do have Durthu. Durthu, of course, is an absolute monster in melee. I'm not entirely sure if he beats Kolek one-on-one without spells. But of course he does have built-in physical resistance. He has 100 armor. He has a crazy weapon strength, very good melee attack and melee defense, good charge bonus. He's basically a very strong hero, except for speed, and obviously susceptible to missiles, but that's irrelevant against Chaos. Alongside him, I did bring, and of course the only spells, I didn't bring too many spells on him. I only brought Curse of Honorir, which in my opinion is now a much better spell than it used to be. It's a 33 second 26 melee attack debuff. The rest of it is kind of meh, but the melee attack is definitely, I think, significant. I also brought Wild Heart, which is when he's casting, it improves my power reserves and power recharge rate. And of course Wiston's Wild Form, which I think is a fairly cheap and efficient choice against Chaos. Because it does boost armor and weapon strength. It's not particularly great. I didn't think Flock of Doom was particularly great here because obviously Chaos tends to bring a lot of armor. Now, Sword of Daith, of course, is I did bring both Sword of Daith and Lamentation of Despair. Lamentation of Despair is just a free magic missile that you can cast on 90-second cooldown, so it's very strong. And Sword of Daith is just an AoE armor debuff and does some damage, so it's very solid, I think. Alongside him, I did bring a Branch Wraith with Earthblood and Penumbral Pendulum. Of course, the Branch Wraith has been buffed to 60 armor from where it was formerly 30, and has some pretty solid melee stats, as well as providing decent melee stats to nearby units with Call of the Woods, which is +5 bonus to melee attack. For my front line, I did bring a quartet of 4 Eternal Guard. These guys do not have shields, but I did invest in some chevrons for them. Now, you might be wondering why I didn't just go upgrade straight to shields, and the reason is actually, if I put chevrons into them, I'll actually get better melee attack out of them, and their melee defense will be roughly comparable with, or maybe slightly better than the shielded variant. And shields are honestly unnecessary against Chaos, but the better melee attack might improve my chances or improve my performance in close quarters. Beyond that, I have 2 units of Wildwood Rangers. These guys, of course, got changed quite significantly. They're now much more damage oriented. I don't throw things in slow-mo. They're much more damage oriented against infantry specifically. They do still have their immunity to psychology, and when they're in woods, they get a charge defense against large as well as a +12 bonus versus large. But it's much more niche than prior, where they just had a flat bonus against large, though not as significant as the War Dancers with Azrai Spear. These guys do have very good melee attack. They have very decent melee defense. Very low armor, but they're pretty mobile, and they can tear through enemy infantry rather quickly. Beyond that, I brought 4 units of Glade Guard with Starfire Shafts, which is a little overkill given how weak my front line really is. But I was hoping that with the help of the Wild Riders, I would be able to just tie down my opponent and buy my Glade Guard some time to just gun the enemy down. For my opponent, he did go with and then of course I do have Wild Riders. Wild Riders, while they don't do that well against armor, they do still do decent damage. Their charge bonus is actually buffed, I do believe. These guys do cause fear, which is generally useful against Chaos, which of course tends to be susceptible to fear. And still is chosen to not get an immunity to psychology buff, which is kind of what a lot of people were hoping for, but they didn't. For my opponent, though, it's not going to be too useful in this matchup because my opponent has brought a lot of Forsaken to the field. He's brought 6 units of Forsaken, which is the max you can bring. These guys, of course, have very good melee stats, crazy weapon strength, and they absolutely tear through the lightly armored Elven infantry. Though at least I do have a lot of armor piercing, so these guys won't be. Their 75 armor is not really going to offer much protection. On the flanks, my opponent does have a unit of Chaos Knights with lances on one end and 3 units of Chaos Knights with normal swords on the other end. Now, normally, if I'd brought, for example, Azrai Spears, which I do tend to bring usually, this would not be as much of a threat, but with the way my army's set up here with generally pretty slow infantry and my only fast flex contingent being Wild Riders, I'm definitely exposed to be susceptible to these Chaos Knights. And they're going in with Kolek Suneater, who did not actually bring his hammer, his Star Crusher ability, but he did, so he's not getting a bonus to damage, but he does have Stormcaller, so he can definitely beat up some of my troops pretty effectively. And it did actually surprise me. I wasn't really expecting Kolek, because Kolek's pretty susceptible to shooting, despite his 25% missile resistance and 100 armor, but still, my opponent did bring him. And I did see Kolek immediately, because Kolek can't be hidden in woods, but I did not see the knights in time. As you can see, we are pushing straight into each other. I'm trying to use Durthu as well as the Branch Wraith to absorb the enemy charges from the Forsaken, and throwing some Wild Riders into the Forsaken over here. My hope being that the Wild Riders will do some decent damage to the Forsaken, then I can quickly pull them out and follow up with the Eternal Guard, who I'm trying to make sure that my Eternal Guard gets their charge bonuses off. Of course, it's going to be a terrible trade with the Forsaken, who are far more powerful in melee, but it's better to get some charge bonus than none at all. You can see I'm over casting Earthblood to save my Branch Wraith over here, and unfortunately my Wild Riders do not get their charge off against Kolek. So now they are in the fray, and these guys are melee caps, so even without their charge bonus, they will do fairly well against Kolek. And you can see they always stripped him down by about 800 HP in the space of a few seconds. Unfortunately, this does mean my opponent is able to just plow past with these Chaos Knights, and I have nothing to shut him down. Even on the left flank, my opponent's Forsaken and Chaos Knights with Lances have torn through these Wild Riders, and Wild Riders will not trade well with Knights at all. Over here, the Forsaken did have their charge blunted a bit by the charge of the Wild Riders, so they're not doing that well against the Eternal Guard. Eternal Guard with the Veterancy actually has very high melee defense, and with armor piercing against the low melee defense of Forsaken, especially once they lose their Frenzy, these guys are much weaker. You can see the Eternal Guard has chased off these Forsaken, and here in the center, the Branch Wraith plus the Eternal Guard are doing fairly well, but unfortunately at this stage, despite breaking some of my opponent's front line, I was definitely worried that I was going to lose the game, because with the bombardments going down and my opponent breaking apart my ranged contingent in the back, I'm looking at a very, very grim result here. You can see these Wild Riders are routing off, and they will not be coming back. Most of my Glade Guard, or our Glade Guard, have been shattered. You can see I do fire off Lamentation of Despair there, but Kolek is still pretty healthy. And the Wild Riders over here really badly beat up. Now, unfortunately, my Wildwood Rangers are pushing into the Chaos Knights, but these guys do not have a bonus against large when they're outside of woods anymore, so they're much weaker at that. Over here, the Forsaken are getting shredded, though. They've got caught kind of in a pit here between all the Eternal Guard and the Wildwood Rangers, and they're getting absolutely shredded. These guys will not be making it out at all. Definitely not in good order. But now I'm getting in turn countercharged by the Chaos Knights, and but Chaos Knights will not do that well against Eternal Guard. These guys have very good melee attack and very good melee defense, but at the same time Eternal Guard has very solid melee stats, and they have armor piercing. Over here, Durthu is slugging it out with the big man himself, and unfortunately my Wild Riders are going to just die here because they're being surrounded by Chaos Knights with lances, and these guys are just going down like 9 pins. You can see Kolek takes down 5 models with a single hit. In the meantime, though, Durthu is hitting like an absolute truck, and you can see he's actually dropped Kolek down to float to 2200, which is about less than a third of his HP. At this point, you can see my army is looking pretty tattered. I'm peppering down these Chaos Knights with some archery fire and pincer, keeping them tied down with the Wildwood Rangers. But now my opponent has spotted them, and he's simply pushing in with Kolek, and these guys do have shields, so they are somewhat survivable. Here in the pits, though, my infantry is actually holding pretty well against the Chaos Knights, because most of these guys are anti-large, and the Wildwood Rangers and, of course, Durthu both have armor piercing, so they actually tear through these pretty effectively. So my opponent is definitely having trouble cracking this tough nut of an army here, the infantry corps. Though with some cycle charging, my Wildwood Rangers are definitely starting to struggle, and you can see my Eternal Guard gets caught up and shattered here pretty badly. And of course, these Glade Guard are absolutely getting shredded by Kolek. They've landed like one hit on it, just done practically no damage. But this center, the heart of my army, is still around and kicking. Durthu is more than healthy. The Branch Wraith is still in decent shape, and I still have a little bit of Winds of Magic every now and then. And of course, Durthu does have his spells, or his innate abilities, such as Sword of Daith and Lamentation of Despair. You can see the spears are just trying to swamp these Chaos Knights, and of course, when they're clumped up like this, I'm getting full value out of spells such as Earthblood, as well as the AOE effect from the Branch Wraith. And every little bit counts in this situation where I'm just trying to grind against enemy cavalry. You can see my Glade Guard are actually coming back. Some of my Wildwood Rangers have actually recovered, and these Glade Guard have also recovered. And every little bit of damage I can get out of my opponent at this point is a boon. Over here, my opponent is casting a very good Stormcaller, which hits all these units. I couldn't really move them out of position, or out of the way in time. In the meantime, my opponent has caught sight of these poor Glade Guards, so they're going to go down very, very shortly. You can see I do cast a Sword of Daith over here, trying to whittle down these Chaos Knights with Lances. It's not ideal against Chaos Knights with Lances, but it does do decent damage. And now Kolek does kind of desperately charge in. But Kolek can't really afford to stay in here. If he stays in here, and Durthu gets on top of him, even though Durthu does not have a bonus against large, he will absolutely annihilate Kolek at this stage of the game. I'm not, like I said before, I'm not entirely sure if one-on-one, but full health, Kolek wins. But Durthu, in this sort of situation, when Kolek's this badly beaten down, it will most likely triumph. Now my Wildwood Rangers and the Glade Guard are coming out, trying to fight my opponent. You can see, unfortunately, my Glade Guard over here got completely stomped by the Knights. But now my opponent is just trying to desperately cycle charge me into Oblivion, and it's just not really working. See another Lamentation of Despair just go down. Kolek beating him up. My opponent has landed a nasty charge here with the Chaos Knights. But this core of infantry and Durthu, of course, are still holding, and they're slowly but surely eating away at my enemy's troops. I'm not able to pursue them because, of course, I lost my Wild Riders so early on, and my opponent's troops are too fast for my infantry to catch. The only infantry I could have brought to break through my opponent's troops would have been War Dancers, and, of course, I did not bring them. Now here my opponent does charge in with Kolek. He's just laying the smack down on these poor Glade Guards who really don't stand a chance, and they're actually going to tear her out almost instantly. But my opponent's cavalry contingent is definitely falling apart. The Chaos Knights do cause fear, so they're immune to fear-causing units, such as the Branch Wraith, but they're not immune to Durthu's terror, and the results are kind of visible here. You can see that these guys are kind of dropped. There's some of their morale is occasionally dropping, and you can see at this point these guys are wavering and they get terrified off. And Durthu is like an absolute truck, of course. I'd say at this point my opponent, despite trying to get Kolek in there, actually ends up breaking, and it gives me a Pyrrhic victory on what was a very close match. Now, had he wanted to, my opponent could have actually denied me the win there simply by running circles around the map, and I would never have been able to catch him at that later stage of the game. But going for the win, it turned into Grindfest in the center, and the fact of the matter was that the heart of my army, the massive anti-large armor piercing, had survived the initial shock, at least to some extent, and the Forsaken, which should have been dealing with them, had been largely wiped out in the initial engagement. If I were to do this comp a little bit differently, it's a little difficult with Wood Elves to squeeze out just that as much of a front line as you can and protect your archers while keeping some decent ranged fire. I think Azrai Spears would have definitely been a better choice here than either the Wildwood Rangers or a better choice than the Wild Riders. And I might have been better off dropping one unit of Glade Guard as well to make room for that. In general, obviously Azrai Spears can just do very well. I might have been better off dropping, say, Glade Guard and one of the units of Wild Riders, and that way making room for some Azrai Spears, which would have still left me with a very solid armor piercing contingent, but given me much better coverage against enemy large. So definitely a bit of a mistake on my part. For my opponent, the Forsaken are a very good choice, honestly, against Wood Elves. They'll tear through basically any Wood Elf infantry in a matter of seconds. The possible exception of the revised Dryads. The new Dryads have a bit more armor, so they might be a little more survivable. But with that exception, I do believe Forsaken will basically tear through most Elven infantry in a matter of seconds. I think definitely I think there was definitely some pretty crucial parts there. I think the fact that Durthu is just a monster in melee and survivable helped a lot in that situation. The Wildwood Rangers, I'm honestly pretty impressed with. I think they're a pretty solid unit now. Obviously, they struggled a bit to catch the Knights and slug it out with them, but these guys definitely kind of tank like champs, and they tore through the Forsaken pretty effectively. They have very solid melee stats now, and they're definitely built to cut through heavily armored infantry very well. The Glade Guard, I think they just got swamped because I didn't have the coverage on the rear line. And the Wild Riders, of course, performed very badly. This was about as bad of a matchup as you can get with Wood Elves. The unfortunate fact is that you do have to be ready to fight against Chaos Warriors, because Chaos Warriors with just normal Chaos Warriors are a fairly common sight, because they do have silver shields and they hit hard enough to tear through Wood Elf troops pretty quickly. So you'll see them fairly often. And I do believe it's worthwhile to be kind of prepared to deal with that by bringing some Starfires and Wild Riders. But definitely good again to my opponent. It was very close, came right down to the wire. I think my opponent had a slightly better coordination at getting his Knights into my backline before his Forsaken engaged. It might have been enough to sway that battle in his favor. So definitely a very tight match. Very well played. I do hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below. If you have any comments, criticism, any questions about Total War Warhammer 2, Mortal Empires, that sort of stuff, be sure to post them down in the comments, and I'll respond as soon as I can. As usual, guys, I do appreciate you all for watching, and I will see you on the next one. Bye for now.